Volume 1, Chapters 7 and 8 of The Widow Barnaby by Francis Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The elegance of Mrs. Barnaby displayed. Its effect on her Aunt Betsy. Interview between the brother and sister. Agnes Willoughby had never been in Silverton from the day that her Aunt Betsy first took her from her grandfather's house. Had Mrs. Compton lived, she would probably have battled for the performance of Miss Betsy's promise, that the little girl should sometimes visit them; but though it is probable Mrs. Barnaby might occasionally have thought of her niece with some degree of interest and curiosity, the feeling was not strong enough to induce her to open a correspondence with Miss Betsy. Still it was certainly not without something like pleasure that she found she was again to see her. Miss Betsy arrived late in the evening on the day on which the summons reached her, and being shown into Mrs. Barnaby's smart drawing-room, was received with much stateliness by that lady, who derived considerable consolation, under the disagreeable necessity of welcoming a person she detested, from the opportunity it afforded her of displaying the enormous increase of wealth and importance that had fallen upon her since they last met. Poor Miss Betsy really felt sad at the thoughts of the errand upon which she was come. Nevertheless, she could not, without some difficulty, suppress her inclination to smile at the full-blown dignity of Mrs. Barnaby. Fond as this lady was of parading her grandeur on all occasions, she had never, even among the dear friends whom she most especially desired to inspire with envy, felt so strong an inclination to show off her magnificence as on the present. The covers were removed from the chairs and sofas. The eclipse produced by the dim grey drugget, when stretched across the radiance of the many-coloured carpet, was over. 5 golden-leaved annuals, the glory of her library, were spread at well-graduated distances upon her round table. Her work-box, bright in its rose-coloured lining, her smart embossed letter-case, her chimney ornaments, her picture-frames, her footstools, all were uncovered, all were studiously shown forth to meet the careless eye of Miss Betsy, while the proud owner of all these very fine things, notwithstanding the gloomy state of her mansion, was herself a walking museum of lace and trinkets. Nor were her manners less superb than her habiliments. " I am sorry, Miss Compton," she said, " I may call you Miss Compton now, as my marriage put an end to the possibility of any confusion. I am sorry that your first introduction to my humble abode should have been made under circumstances so melancholy. Dismal as of necessity everything must look now, I can assure you that this unpretending little room is the scene of much domestic comfort." This was unblushingly said, though the cold, stiff-looking apartment was never entered but upon solemn occasions, when the whole house was turned inside out for the reception of company. Miss Betsy, or rather Miss Compton, as, in compliance with Mrs. Barnaby's hint, we will in future call her, looked round upon the spotless carpet and upon all the comfortless precision of the apartment, and replied, " If this is your common living-room, niece Martha, you are certainly much improved in neatness ; and seeing it so prim, it is quite needless to ask if you have any children." This reply was bitter every way; for first, it spoke plainly enough the spinster's disbelief in the domestic elegance of her niece, and secondly, it alluded to her being childless, a subject of very considerable mortification to Mrs. Barnaby. How far this sort of ambush warfare might have proceeded it is impossible to say, as it would have been difficult to place together any two people who more cordially disliked each other. But before Mrs. Barnaby had time to seek for words bearing as sharp a sting as those she had received, her husband entered. He waited not for the pompous introduction his wife was preparing, but walking up to his guest, addressed her respectfully but mournfully, saying he feared it was necessary to press an early interview with her brother, if she wished that he should be sensible of her kindness in coming to him. Miss Compton immediately rose, and uttering a short, strong phrase expressive of gratitude for his kindness to the dying man, said she was ready to attend him. She found her brother quite sensible, but very weak, and evidently approaching his last hour. He thanked her for coming to him, warmly expressed his gratitude to Mr. Barnaby, and then murmured something about wishing to see little Agnes before he died. " She will be here to morrow, brother," replied Miss Compton, " and in time, I trust, to receive your blessing." " Thank you, sister Betsy. But tell me before you go, have you sold father's poor dear fields as I have done? That is all I have got to be very sorry for. I ought never to have done that, sister Betsy." Mr. Barnaby had left the room as soon as he had placed Miss Compton in a chair by the sick man's bed, and none but an old woman who acted as his nurse remained in it. " You may go, nurse, if you please, for a little while. I will watch my brother," said Miss Compton. The woman obeyed, and they were left alone. The old man followed the nurse with his eyes as she retreated, and when she closed the door, said, "I am glad we are alone once more, dear sister, for you are the only one I could open my heart to. I don't believe I have been a very wicked man, Sister Betsy, though I am afraid I never did much good to anybody, nor to myself neither. But the one thing that lies heavy at my heart is having sold away my poor father's patrimony. I can't help thinking, Betsy, that I see him every now and then at the bottom of my bed, with his old hat and his spud and his brown gaiters, and I never told anybody, but he seems always just going to repeat the last words he ever said to me, which were spoken just like as I am now speaking to you, Betsy, with his last breath. And he said, 'Josiah, my son, I could not die with a safe conscience if I left my poor weakly Betsy without sufficient to keep her in the same quiet comfort as she has been used to. But it would grieve me, Josiah. Oh, how plain I hear his voice at this minute. It would grieve me, Josiah,' he said, 'if I thought the acres would be parted for ever. They have been above 400 years belonging to us from father to son. And once Compton Basset was a name that stood for 1,000 acres instead of 300. And then — don't be angry, Sister Betsy," said the sick man, pressing her hand, which he held, "but he said, 'I don't think Betsy very likely to marry. And if she don't, Josiah, why then, all that is left of Compton Basset will be joined together again for your descendants. And yet after this I sold my portion, Betsy. And I do fear his poor spirit is troubled for it. I do indeed, and it is that which hangs so heavy upon my mind.'" "And if that be all, Josiah, you may close your eyes and go to join our dear father in peace. He struggled with and conquered his strongest feeling, his just and honorable pride, for my sake; and for his, as well as for the same feeling, which is very strong within my own breast also, I have lived poorly, though not hardly, Josiah, and have added penny to penny till I was able to make Compton Basset as respectable a patrimony as he left it. It was not Farmer Wright who bought the land, brother. It was I." The old man's emotion at hearing this was stronger than any he had shown for many years. He raised his sister's hand to his lips and kissed it fervently. "Bless you, Betsy! Bless you, my own dear sister!" he said in a voice that trembled as much from feeling as from weakness, and for several minutes afterwards he lay perfectly silently and motionless. Miss Compton watched him with an anxious eye, and not without a flutter at her heart lest she should suddenly find his stillness to be that of death. But it was not so. On the contrary, his voice appeared considerably stronger than it had done since their interview began, when he spoke, and said, "I see him now, Sister Betsy, as plainly as I see the two posts at the bottom of my bed, and he stands exactly in the middle between them. He has got no hat on, but his smooth white hair is round his face just as it used to be, and he looks so smiling and so happy. Do not think I am frightened at seeing him, Betsy. Quite the contrary. I feel so peaceful, so very peaceful." "Then try to sleep, dear brother," said Miss Compton, who felt that his pulse fluttered, and aware that his senses were wandering, feared that the energy with which he spoke might hasten the last hour, and so rob his grandchild of his blessing. "I will sleep," he replied, more composedly, "as soon as you have told me one thing. Who will have the Compton Basset estate, Betsy, when you are dead?" "Agnes Willoughby," replied the spinster solemnly. "That is right. Now go away, Betsy. It is quite right. Go away now, and let me sleep." She watched him for a moment, and seeing his eyes close, and hearing a gentle, regular breathing, that convinced her he was indeed asleep, she crept noiselessly from his bedside; then, having summoned the nurse, and re-established her beside the fire, retired to the solitude of her own room. CHAPTER VIII. Solitary meditation and important resolutions. Agnes Willoughby arrives at Silverton. Her grandfather gives her his blessing, and dies. Miss Compton makes a sudden retreat. When Miss Compton reached her room, she found a tiny morsel of fire just lighted in a tiny grate, and as the season was November, the hour 9 p.m., and the candle she carried in her hand not of the brightest description, the scene was altogether gloomy enough. But not even to save herself from something greatly worse would she at that moment have exchanged its solitude for the society of Mrs. Barnaby, although she had been sure of finding her in the best lighted room, and seated beside the brightest fire that ever blazed. So, wrapping around her the stout camlet cloak, by the aid of which she had braved the severity of many years' wintry walks to church, she sat down in the front of the little fire, and gave herself up to the reflections that crowded upon her mind. Elizabeth Compton did not believe in the doctrine of ghosts. Her mind was of a strong and healthy fibre, which was rarely sufficiently wrought upon by passing events to lose its power of clear perception and unimpassioned judgment; but the scenes she had just passed through had considerably shaken her philosophy. 35 years had passed since Josiah and Elizabeth shared the paternal roof together. They were then very tender friends, for he was affectionate and sweet-tempered; and she, though nearly 17, was as young in appearance and as much in need of his thoughtful care of her as if she had been many years younger. But this union was totally and for ever destroyed when Josiah married. From the first hour they met, the two sisters-in-law conceived an aversion for each other, which every succeeding interview appeared to strengthen; and this so effectually separated the brother from the sister, that they had never met again with that peculiar species of sympathy which can only be felt by children of the same parents, till now that the sister came expressly to see the brother die. This reunion had softened and had opened both their hearts. Josiah confessed to his dear sister Betsy that his conscience reproached him for having made away with his patrimony, a fact which he had never hinted to any other human being; and she owned to him that she was secretly possessed of landed property worth over 600 a year, and also, which was a confidence if possible more sacred still, that Agnes Willoughby would inherit it. It would be hardly doing justice to the good sense of Miss Betsy to state that this rational and proper destination of her property had never been finally decided upon by her till the moment she answered her brother's question on the subject; and still less correctly true would it be to say, that the dying man's delirious fancy respecting the presence of their father was the reason that she answered that appeal in the manner she did; yet still there might be some slight mixture of truth in both. Miss Compton was constantly in the habit of telling herself that she had not decided to whom she would leave her property; but it was no less true that the only person she ever thought of as within the possibility of becoming her heir was Agnes. It is certain also, as I have stated above, that Miss Compton did not believe that departed spirits ever revisited the earth. Nevertheless, the dying declaration of Josiah, that he saw the figure of his father, did produce a spasm at her heart, which found great relief by her pronouncing the words, Agnes Willoughby. And now that she was quietly alone, and perfectly restored to her sober senses, she began to reconsider all that she had spoken, and to pass judgment upon herself for the having yielded in some degree to the weakness of a visionary imagination. The result, however, of this self-examination was not exactly what she herself expected. At first she was disposed to exclaim mentally, I have been foolish, I have been weak. But as she gazed abstractedly on her little fire, and thought of all the chain of events, each so little in itself, yet all so linked together as to produce an important whole, by which she, the sickly, crooked little Betsy Compton, had become the proprietor of the long-preserved patrimony of her ancestors, and also when she remembered the infinite chances which had existed against either of her portionless, uneducated nieces forming such a marriage as might produce a child of gentle blood to be her successor, when she thought of all this, and that, notwithstanding the lieutenant's poverty, the name of Willoughby could disgrace none to which it might be joined, she could not but feel that all things had been managed for her better than she could have managed them for herself. And if, thought she, I was influenced, by hearing my poor father so accurately described, to bind myself at once by a promise to make little Agnes my heir, how do I know but that Providence intended it should be so? Is my freedom of action then gone for ever? She continued, carrying on her mental soliloquy. The idea was painful to her, and her head sunk upon her breast as she brooded upon it. Not so, she muttered to herself, after some minutes' cogitation. I am not pledged to this, nor shall it be so. If indeed some emanation from my father's mind has made itself felt by his children this night, it ought not to make a timid slave of me, but rather rouse my courage and my strength to do something more than mere justice to the race that seems so strangely entrusted to my care. And so I will, if the girl be such a one as may repay the trouble. If not, I will show that I have still some freedom left. Miss Compton had never seen Agnes Willoughby from the time she first took her from Silverton. Deeply shocked at the profound ignorance in which she found the poor little girl when she visited Compton Basett, she had set herself very earnestly to discover where she could immediately place her, with the best chance of her recovering the time she had so negligently been permitted to lose, and by good luck heard of a clergyman's family in which young ladies were received for a stipend of £50 a year, and treated more like the children of affectionate parents than the pupils of mercenary teachers. The good spinster heard all this, and was well pleased by the description. Yet would she not trust to it, but breaking through all her habits, she put herself into a post chaise and drove to the rectory at Empton, a distance of at least 20 miles from the town of Silverton. Here she found everything she wished to find. A small, regular establishment, a ladylike and very intelligent woman, with an accomplished young person, her only child, fully capable of undertaking the education of a gentleman's daughter, while the venerable father of the family and of the parish, by his gentle manners and exemplary character, ensured exactly the sort of respectability in the home she sought for the little Agnes, which she considered as its most essential feature. The preliminaries were speedily arranged, and as soon as a neat and sufficient wardrobe was ready for her use, her final separation from her improvident grandmother took place in the manner that has been related. When Miss Compton left the little girl in the charge of Mrs. Wilmot, she had certainly no idea of her remaining there above 3 years without visiting or being seen by any of her family; but Mrs. Wilmot, in her subsequent letters, so strongly urged the advantage of not disturbing studies so late begun, and now proceeding so satisfactorily, that our reasonable aunt Betsy willingly submitted to her remaining quietly where she was; an arrangement rendered the more desirable by the death of her grandmother and the breaking up of the establishment which had been her only home. The seeing her again after this long absence was now an event of very momentous importance to Miss Compton. Should she in any way resemble either her grandmother or her aunt Barnaby, the little spinster felt that the promise so solemnly given would become a sore pain and grief to her, for rather 1,000 times would she have bequeathed her carefully collected wealth to the county hospital, than have bestowed it to swell the vulgar ostentation of a Mrs. Barnaby. The power of choice, however, she felt was no longer left her. She had pledged her word, and that under the circumstances of no common solemnity, that Agnes Willoughby should be her heir. The poor little lady, as these anxious ruminations harassed her mind, became positively faint and sick as the idea occurred to her, that the eyes of little Agnes had formerly sparkled with somewhat of the brightness she thought so very hateful in her well-rouged aunt; and at length, having sat till her candle was nearly burnt out, and her fire too, she arose in order to return to the fine drawing-room and bid her entertainers good night. But she stood with clasped hands for one moment upon the hearth-stone before she quitted it, and muttered half aloud, "I have said that Agnes Willoughby shall be my heir, and so she shall. She shall. She be a Gorgon or a second Martha, inherit the Compton Basett acres, restored, improved, and worth at least 1/4 more than when my poor father, Heaven give his spirit rest, divided them between his children. But for my snug £12,000 sterling vested in the 3 per cents, and my little mortgage of 1,800 more for which I so regularly get my 5 per cent, that at least is my own, and that shall never, never go to enrich any one who inherits the red cheeks and bright black eyes of Miss Martha Wisett. No, not if I am driven to choose an heir for it from the Foundling Hospital." Somewhat comforted in spirit by this magnanimous resolve, Miss Compton found her way to the drawing-room, and would have been fully confirmed in the wisdom of it, had any doubt remained, by the style and tone of Mrs. Barnaby, whom she found sitting there in solitary state, her husband being professionally engaged in the town, and her own anxiety for her dying father quite satisfied by being told that he was asleep. "And where have you been hiding yourself, aunt Betsy, since you left papa?" said the full-dressed lady, warmed into good humour by the consciousness of her own elegance, and the delightful contrast between a married woman sitting in her own handsome drawing-room, looking as she had just ascertained that she herself did look by a long solitary study of her image in the glass, and a poor crooked little old maid like her visitor. "I have been expecting to see you for this hour past. I hope Barnaby will be in soon, and then we will go to supper. Barnaby always eats a hot supper, and so I eat with him for company, and I hope you feel disposed to join us after your cold drive." "I never eat any supper at all, Mrs. Barnaby." "No, really? I thought farmhouse people always did, though not exactly such a supper as Barnaby's, perhaps, for he always will have something nice and delicate. and so, as it pleases him, I have taken to the same sort of thing myself — veal cutlets and mashed potatoes, or half a chicken grilled perhaps, with now and then a glass of raspberry cream, or a mince pie, as the season may be, all which I take to be very light and wholesome, and indeed Barnaby thinks so too, or else I am sure he would not let me touch it. You can't think, aunt Betsy, what a fuss he makes about me. To be sure he is a perfect model of a husband. God grant she may be the colour of a tallow candle, and her eyes as pale and lustreless as those of a dead whiting," mentally ejaculated the whimsical spinster, but in reply to her niece she said nothing. After sitting, however, for about 10 minutes in the most profound silence, she rose and said, " I should like to have a bed candle, if you please, ma'am. I need not wait to see the doctor. If he thinks there is any alteration in my brother, he will be kind enough to let me know." The lady of the mansion condescendingly rang the bell, which her livery boy answered with promptness, for he was exceedingly well drilled, Mrs. Barnaby having little less to do than to keep him and her 2 maids in proper order. The desired candle was brought, and Miss Compton, having satisfied herself that her brother still slept, retired to rest. The following day was an important one to her race. The last male of the Compton Basett family expired, and the young girl to whom its small but ancient patrimony was to descend, appeared for the first time before Miss Compton in the character of her heiress. It was about midday when the post-chaise which conveyed Agnes arrived at Mr. Barnaby's door. Had the person expected been a judge in whose hands the life and death of the spinster freeholder was placed, her heart could hardly have beat with more anxiety to catch a sight of his countenance, and to read her fate in it, than it now did to discover whether her aspect were that of a vulgar beauty or a gentle woman. Miss Compton was sitting in the presence of Mrs. Barnaby when the carriage stopped at the door, and had been for some hours keenly suffering from the disgust which continually increased upon her, at pretty nearly every word her companion uttered. " If she be like this creature," thought she, as she rose from her seat with nervous emotion, " if she be like her in any way, I will keep my promise when I die, but I will never see her more." Nothing but her dread of encountering this hated resemblance prevented her from going down stairs to meet the important little girl ; but after a moment's fidgeting, and taking a step or two towards the door, she came back and reseated herself. The suspense did not last long. The door was opened, and Mus. Willoughby announced. A short round little creature, who, though nearly 14, did not look more than 12, with cheeks as red as roses, and large dark gray eyes, a great deal brighter than ever her aunt's or grandmother's had been, entered, and timidly stopped short in her approach to her 2 aunts, as if purposely to be looked at and examined. She was looked at and examined, and judgment was passed upon her by both; differing very widely, however, as was natural enough, but in which, a circumstance much less natural considering the qualifications for judging possessed by the 2 ladies, the younger showed considerably more discernment than the elder. Mrs. Barnaby thought her, and she was right, exceedingly like what she remembered her very pretty mother at the same age, just as round and rosy, but with a strong mixture of the Willoughby countenance, which was very decidedly patrician both in contour and expression. But poor Miss Compton saw nothing of all this, she saw only that she was short, fat, fresh coloured, and bright eyed. This dreaded spectacle was a death blow to all her hopes, the hated confirmation of all her fears. It was in vain that when the poor child spoke her voice proved as sweet as a voice could be ; in vain that her natural curls fell round her neck, as soon as her bonnet was taken off, in rich chestnut clusters ; in vain that the smile with which she answered Mrs. Barnaby's question, " Do you remember me, Agnes?" displayed teeth as white and as regular as a row of pearls. All these things were but so many items against her in the opinion of Miss Compton. For did they not altogether constitute a brilliant specimen of vulgar beauty? Had Agnes been tall, pale, and slight made, with precisely the same features, her aunt Betsy would have willingly devoted the whole of her remaining life to her, would have ungrudgingly expended every farthing of her income for her comfort and advantage, and would only have abstained from expending the principal too, because she might leave it to her untouched at her death. But now that she saw her, as she fancied, so very nearly approaching in appearance to everything she most disliked, all the long indulged habits of frugality that had enabled her, as she at this moment delighted to remember, to accumulate a fortune over which she still had entire control, seemed to rise before her and press round her very heart, as the only means left of atoning to herself for the promise she had been led to make. I will see the eyes of my father's son closed, thought she, and then I will leave the beauties to manage together as well as they can till mine are closed too. And by that time, perhaps, the rents of the lands that I must no longer consider as my own, and my interest, and my mortgages, may have grown into something rich enough to make them and theirs wish that they had other claims upon Elizabeth Compton besides being her nearest of kin." These thoughts passed rapidly, but their impression was deep and lasting. Miss Compton sat in very stern and melancholy silence, such as perhaps did not ill befit the occasion that had brought them all together. But Mrs. Barnaby, whose habitual propensity to make herself comfortable prevented her from sacrificing either her curiosity or her love of talking to ceremony, ceased not to question Agnes as to the people she had been with, the manner in which she had lived, and the amount of what she had learned. On the first subject she received nothing in return but unbounded, unqualified expressions of praise and affection, such as might either be taken for the unmeaning hyperbole of a silly speaker, or the warm outpouring of well-deserved affection and gratitude. So Miss Compton classed all that Agnes said respecting the family of the Wilmots under the former head. Her record of their manner of living produced exactly the same result. And on the important chapter of her improvements, the genuine modesty of the little girl did her great disservice. For when, in answer to Mrs. Barnaby's questions, "Do you understand French? Can you dance? Can you play? Can you draw?" she invariably answered, "A little." Miss Compton failed not to make a mental note upon it, which, if spoken, would have been, "Little enough, I dare say." This examination had lasted about half an hour, when Mr. Barnaby entered, and addressing them all, said, "Poor Mr. Compton has woke up, and appears quite collected, but from his pulse, I do not think he can last long. Is this Miss Willoughby, Martha? I am sorry that your first visit, my dear, should be so sad a one. But you had better all come now, and take leave of him." The three ladies rose immediately, and, without speaking, followed Mr. Barnaby to the bedside of the dying man. He was evidently sinking fast, but knew them all, and expressed pleasure at the sight of Agnes. "Dear child," he said, looking earnestly at her, "I am glad she is come to take my blessing. God bless you, Agnes. She is very like... God bless you, Agnes. God bless you all." Mr. Barnaby took his wife by the arm, and led her away. She took her weeping niece with her, but Miss Compton shook her head when invited by Mr. Barnaby to follow them, and in a very few minutes completed the duty to perform which she had left her solitude, for with her own hands she closed her brother's eyes, and then stole to her room, from which she speedily dispatched an order for a post-chaise to come immediately to the door. The conduct and manners of Mr. Barnaby had pleased the difficult little lady greatly, and she would willingly have shaken hands with him before leaving his house; but to do this she must have re-entered the drawing room and again seen Mrs. Barnaby and Agnes, a penance which she felt quite unequal to perform. So, leaving a civil message for him with the maid, she went down stairs with as little noise as possible as soon as the chaise was announced, and immediately drove off to Compton Basett. End of chapters 7 and 8. Volume 1, Chapters 9 and 10 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Mr. Barnaby pays a visit to Compton Basett, and receives from the heiress a formal congé. Agnes is sent back to school, and remains there till called home by the news of his death. Some surprise and great indignation were expressed by Mrs. Barnaby on hearing that Miss Compton had departed without the civility of taking leave. She resented greatly the rudeness to herself, but, as she justly said, the meaning of it was much more important to Agnes than to her. "What is to become of her, Mr. Barnaby, I should like to know?" said the angry lady. "Agnes says that Mrs. Wilmot expects her back directly, and who is to pay the expense of sending her, I wonder?" Mr. Barnaby assured her in reply that there would be no difficulty about that, adding that they should doubtless hear from Miss Compton as soon as she had recovered the painful effect of the scenes at which she had so lately been present. Days passed, however, the funeral was over, and everything in the family of Mr. Barnaby restored to its usual routine, yet still they heard nothing of Miss Compton. "I see clearly how it is," said the shrewd lady of the manor. "Aunt Betsy means to throw the whole burden of poor dear little Agnes upon us. And what in the world are we to do with her, Barnaby?" "I cannot think she has any such intention, Martha." After the excellent education she has been giving her for the last 3 or 4 years, it is hardly likely that she would suddenly give her up, when it is impossible that she must have been delighted with her. But at any rate make yourself easy, my dear Martha. If she abandons her, we will not. We have no children of our own, and I think the best thing we can do is to adopt this dear girl. She is really the sweetest little creature I ever saw in my life. I can assure you that when her education is finished, I, for one, should be delighted to have her live with us. What say you to it, Martha? " I am sure you are goodness itself, my dear Barnaby, and if the crabbed, crooked old maid would just promise at once to leave her the little she may have left her after all her ostentatious charities, I should make no objection whatever to our adopting Agnes. She is just like poor Sophy, and it certainly is a pleasure to look at her." " Well, then, don't fret yourself any more about Aunt Betsy. I will call upon her one of these days, when I happen to be going Compton Basett way, and find out, if I can, what she means to do about sending her back to Mrs. Wilmot. It would be a pity not to finish her education, for it is easy to see that she has had great justice done her." It was not, however, till some word from Agnes gave him to understand that she was herself very anxious about going on with her studies, and desirous of letting Mrs. Wilmot know what was become of her, that he made or met an opportunity of conversing with Miss Compton. He found her reading a novel in her chimney corner, and dressed in deep but very homely mourning. She received him civilly, nay, there was even something of kindness in her manner when she reverted to the time she had passed in his house, and thanked him for the hospitality he had shown her. He soon perceived, however, that the name of Agnes produced no feeling of interest ; but that, on the contrary, when he mentioned her, the expression of the old lady's face changed from very pleasing serenity to peevish discomfort ; so he wisely determined to make what he had to say a matter of business, and immediately entered upon it accordingly. " My principal reason, Miss Compton, for troubling you with a visit," said he, " is to learn what are your wishes and intentions respecting Miss Willoughby. Is it your purpose to send her back to Mrs. Wilmot?" " I have already been at a great and very inconvenient expense, Mr. Barnaby, for the education of Agnes Willoughby ; but as I have no intention whatever of straitening my poor little income any further by incurring cost on her account, I am glad that what I have done has been of the nature most likely to make her independent of me, and of you too, Mr. Barnaby, in future. When I first placed her with Mrs. Wilmot, I agreed to keep her there for 5 years, 17 months of which are still unexpired. To this engagement I am willing to adhere ; and though I can't say I think her a very bright girl, but rather perhaps a little inclining towards the contrary, yet still I imagine when she knows she has her own bread to get, she may be induced to exert herself sufficiently during the next year and 5 months to enable her to take the place of governess to very young children, or perhaps that of teacher in a second or third rate school. That's my notion about her, Mr. Barnaby. And now, if you please, I never wish to hear any more upon the subject." Greatly displeased by the manner in which Miss Compton spoke of his young favourite, Mr. Barnaby rose, and very dryly wished her good morning ; adding, however, that no farther delay should take place in sending Miss Willoughby back to resume her studies. He was then bowing off, but the little lady stopped him, saying, " As I have been the means of sending the child to such a distance from her nearest relation, I mean your wife, sir, it is but just that I should pay such travelling expenses as are consequent upon it. Here, sir, is a £10 note that I have carefully set apart for this purpose. Have the kindness to dispense it for her as may seem most convenient. And now, sir, farewell. I wish not again to have my humble retreat disturbed by any person so much above me in all worldly advantages as you and your elegant wife. And having performed what I thought to be my duty by the little Willoughby, I beg to have nothing farther to do with her. I dare say your lady will grow exceedingly fond of her, for it seems to me that they are vastly alike ; and if that happens, there will be no danger of the young girl's wanting anything that a poor, little sickly and deformed old body like me could do for her. Good morning, Mr. Barnaby." Mr. Barnaby silently received the £10, which he thought he had no right to refuse, and, having patiently waited till Miss Compton had concluded her speech, he returned her good morning, and took his leave. The worthy apothecary's account of his visit produced considerable sensation. Agnes indeed received it in silence, but the offensive brightness of her eyes was dimmed for a moment or two by a few involuntary tears. Her young heart was disappointed, For not only had the strong liking conceived by the Wilmot family for her aunt Betsy led her to believe that she must unquestionably like her too, but she gratefully remembered her former gentle, quiet kindness to herself; and worse still, on being brought back amongst her relatives, she had, contrary to what is usual in such cases, conceived the greatest predilection for the only one among them who did not like her at all. But it was not in silence that Mrs. Barnaby received her husband's statement of the capricious old lady's firmly pronounced resolve of never having anything more to do with Agnes Willoughby. All the old familiar epithets of abuse came forth again, as fresh and vigorous as if but newly coined ; and though these were mixed up with language which it was by no means agreeable to hear, her judicious husband suffered her to run on without opposition till she was fairly out of breath, and then closed the conversation by putting a bed candle into her hand, and saying, " Now let us all go to bed, my dear ; and I dare say you will have much pleasure in proving to your peevish relative that, as long as you live, Agnes will want no other aunt to take care of her." The good seed sown with these words brought forth fruit abundantly. Mrs. Barnaby could not do enough in her own estimation to prove to the whole town of Silverton the contrast between Miss Compton and herself, the difference between a bad aunt and a good one. Fortunately for the well-being of Agnes at this important period of her existence, she had inspired a strong feeling of affectionate interest in a more rational being than Mrs. Barnaby. Her well-judging husband thought they should do better service to the young girl by sending her back to Mrs. Wilmot with as little delay as possible, than by keeping her with them for the purpose of proving to all the world that they were the fondest and most generous uncle and aunt that ever a dependent niece was blessed with, and she was sent back to Empton accordingly. In order to do justice to the kindness of Mr. Barnaby's adoption of the desolate girl, it must be remembered that neither he nor his wife had any knowledge of the scene which passed between Miss Compton and her brother before his death, neither had the least idea that the old lady possessed anything beyond her original moiety of the Compton Basset estate ; and they both believed her to be capricious as to render it very probable, although it was remembered she had once talked of leaving it to those who had claims on her, that some of the poor of her parish might eventually become her heirs, an idea which the unaccountable dislike she appeared to have taken to Agnes greatly tended to confirm. Once, during the time that remained for her continuance with the Wilmots, Agnes paid a fortnight's visit to the abode she was now taught to consider as her home. The next time she entered it, a few weeks only before the period fixed for the termination of her studies, she was summoned thither by the very sudden death of her excellent and valuable friend, Mr. Barnaby. This event produced an entire and even violent change in her prospects and manner of life, as well as in those of her aunt ; and it is from this epoch that the narrative promised by the title of The Widow Barnaby actually commences, the foregoing pages being only a necessary prologue to the appearance of my heroine in that character. CHAPTER X. The Widow Barnaby enters actively on her new existence. Her wealth. Her happy prospects. Mrs. Wilmot visits Miss Compton, and obtains leave to introduce Agnes Willoughby. Mrs. Barnaby was really very sorry for the death of her husband, and wept, with little or no effort, several times during the dismal week that preceded his interment ; but she was not a woman to indulge long in so very unprofitable a weakness, and accordingly, as soon as the funeral was over, and the will read, by which he left her sole executrix and sole legatee of all he possessed, she very rationally began to meditate upon her position, and upon the best mode of enjoying the many good things which had fallen to her share. She certainly felt both proud and happy at the thought of her independence and her wealth. Of the first she unquestionably had as much as it was possible for woman to possess, for no human being existed who had any right whatever to control her. On the second, her judgment would have been more correct had she better understood the value of money. Though it is hardly possible any day should pass without adding something to the knowledge of all civilized being on this subject, it is nevertheless certain that there are two modes of education which lead the mind in after life into very erroneous estimates respecting it. The one is being brought up to spend exactly as much money as you please, and the other having it deeply impressed on your mind that you are to spend none at all. In the first case, it is long before the most complete reverse of fortune can make the ci-devant rich man understand how a little money can be eked out, so as to perform the office of a great deal ; and in the last, the change from having no money to having some will often, if it come suddenly, so puzzle all foregone conclusions, as to leave the possessor wonderfully little power to manage it discreetly. The latter case was pretty nearly that of Mrs. Barnaby, When she learned that her dear lost husband had left her uncontrolled mistress of property to the amount of £372 per annum, besides the house and furniture, the shop and all it contained, she really felt as if her power in this life were colossal, and that she might roam the world either for conquest or amusement, or sustain in Silverton the style of a retired duchess, as might suit her fancy best. Never yet had this lady's temper been so amiably placid, or so caressingly kind, as during the first month of her widowhood. She gave Agnes to understand that she wished to be considered as her mother, and trusted that they should find in each other all the happiness and affection which that tenderest of ties was so well calculated to produce. " It will not be my fault, Agnes," she said, " if such be not the case. Thanks be to Heaven and my dear lost Barnaby, I have wealth enough to consult both your pleasure and advantage in my future mode of life. And be assured, my dear, that however much my own widowed feelings might lead me to prefer the tranquil consolations of retirement, I shall consider it my duty to live more for you than for myself; and I will indeed hasten, in spite of my feelings, to lay aside these sad weeds, that I may be able, with as little delay as possible, to give you such an introduction to the world as my niece has a right to expect." Agnes was at a loss what to reply. She had still all the frank straightforwardness of a child who has been educated by unaffected, sensible people, and yet she knew that she must not on this occasion say quite what she thought, which would probably have been, " Pray don't fancy that I want you to throw aside your widow's weeds for me, aunt. I don't believe you are one half as sorry for Uncle Barnaby's death as I am." But fortunately there was no mixture of betise in her frankness ; and though it might have been beyond her power to express any great satisfaction at being thus addressed, she had no difficulty in saying, " You are very kind to me, aunt," for this was true. Notwithstanding this youthful frankness of mind, however, Agnes had by this time lost in a great measure that very childish look which distinguished her at the time her appearance so little pleased the fastidious taste of Miss Compton. She was still indeed in very good health, which was indicated by a colour as fresh, and almost as delicate too, as that of a wild rose ; but her rapid growth during the last 2 years had quite destroyed the offensive roundness, and her tall, well made person gave as hopeful a promise as could be wished for of womanly grace and beauty. The fair face was already the very perfection of loveliness ; and had the secretly proud Miss Compton seen her as she walked in her deep, heavy mourning beside her wide spreading aunt to church, on the Sunday when that lady first restored herself to the public eye, she might perchance have thought that not only was she worthy to inherit Compton Basett and all its accumulated rents, but any other glory and honour that this little earth of ours could bestow. A feeling of strong mutual affection between the parties led both the Wilmot family and Agnes to petition earnestly that the few weeks which remained of the stipulated, and already paid for 5 years, might be completed ; and Mrs. Barnaby, though it was really somewhat against her inclination, consented. But though she had not desired this renewed absence of her niece, the notable widow determined to put it to profit, and set about a final arrangement of all her concerns with an activity that proved good Mr. Barnaby quite right in not having troubled her with any assistant executor. She soon contrived to learn who it was who wished to succeed her dear Barnaby, and managed matters so admirably well as to make the eager young man pay for the house, furniture, shop, etc., etc., about half as much again as they were worth, cleverly contriving, moreover, to retain possession for 3 months. This important business being settled, she set herself earnestly and deliberately to consider what, when these 3 months should expire, she should do with her freedom, her money, herself, and her niece. In deciding upon this question, she called none to counsel, for she had sense enough to avow to herself that she should pay not the slightest attention to any opinion but her own. In silence and in solitude, therefore, she pondered upon the future ; and to assist her speculations, she drew forth from the recesses of an old fashioned bureau sundry documents and memoranda relative to the property bequeathed to her by her husband. It was evident that her income would now somewhat exceed £400 a year, and this appeared to her amply sufficient to assist the schemes already working in her head for future aggrandizement, but by no means equal to what she felt her beauty and her talents gave her a right to hope for. It is, however, a handsome income, thought she, and such a one as, with my person, may and must, if properly made use of, lead to all I wish. Mrs. Barnaby had once heard it said by a clever human, wishes might oftener be achieved, did mortals better know how to act about obtaining them. First, said the oracle, let him be sure to find out what his wishes really are. This ascertained, let him, in the second place, employ all his acuteness to discover what is required for their fulfilment. Thirdly, let him examine himself and his position in order to decide how much he, or it, can contribute towards this. Fourthly, let him subtract the sum of the capabilities he possesses from the total of means required. Fifthly, let him learn by, with, and in his heart of hearts, what it is that constitutes the remainder. And sixthly, and lastly, let him gird up the loins of his resolution, and start forth determined to acquire them. Whoso doeth this shall seldom fail. In the course of her visitings, military friendships, and all included, Mrs. Barnaby, even in the small arena of Silverton, had heard several wise things in her day; but none of them ever produced such lasting effects as the words I have just quoted. They touched some chord within her that vibrated, not indeed with such a thrill as they might have made to ring along the nerves of a fine creature new to life, and emulous of all things good and great, but with a little sharp twitch, just at that point of the brain where self-love expands itself into a mesh of ways and means, instinct with will, to catch all it can that may be brought home to glut the craving for enjoyment. And so pregnant did they seem to her of the only wisdom that she wished to master, that her memory seized upon them with extraordinary energy, nor ever after relinquished its hold. Little, however, could it profit her at the time she heard it, but she kept it, like an ape in the corner of his jaw, first mouthed to be last swallowed. It was upon these words that she now pondered. Her two elbows set on the open bureau, her legs stretched under it, her lips resting upon the knuckles of her clasped hands, and her eyes fixed in deep abstraction on the row of pigeon-holes before her, she entered upon a sort of self-catechism, which ran thus: Question. What is it that I most wish for on earth? Answer. A rich and fashionable husband. Q. What is required to obtain this? A. Beauty, fortune, talents, and a free entrance into good society. Q. Do I possess any of these? And which? A. I possess beauty, fortune, and talents. Q. What remains wanting? A. A free entrance into good society. True! She exclaimed aloud. It is that I want, and it is that I must procure. Notwithstanding her sanguine estimate of herself, the widow, when she arrived at this point, was fain to confess that she did not know exactly how this necessary addition to her ways and means was to be acquired. Beyond the town of Silverton, and a thinly inhabited circuit of a mile or two round it, she had not a personal acquaintance in the world. This was a very perplexing consideration for a lady determined upon finding her way into the first circles, but its effect was rather to strengthen than relax her energies. There was, however, one person, and she truly believed one only in the wide world, who might, at her first setting out upon her progress, be useful to her. This was a sister of Mr. Barnaby's, married to a clothier whose manufactory was at Frome, but whose residence was happily at Clifton, near Bristol. She had never seen this lady, or any of her family, all intercourse between the brother and sister having of late years consisted in letters, not very frequent, and the occasional interchange of presents, a jar of turtle being now and then forwarded by mail from Bristol, and dainty quarters of Exmoor mutton, and tin pots of clouted cream, returned from Silverton. Nevertheless, Mrs. Peters was her sister-in-law just as much as if they had lived next door to each other for the last 5 years, and she had, of course, a right to all the kindness and hospitality so near a connection demands. A clothier's wife, to be sure, was not exactly the sort of person she would have chosen, had choice been left her, but it was better than nothing, infinitely better, and besides, as the logical widow's head went on to reason, she may introduce me to people above herself. At a public place, too, like Clifton, it must be so easy, and then every new acquaintance I make will serve to lead on to another. I am not so shy but I can turn all accidents to account, and I am not such a fool as to stand at one end of a room when I ought to be at the other. Mrs. Barnaby never quoted Shakespeare, or she would probably have added here, Why then the world's mine oyster, which I with wit will open, for it was with some such thought that her soliloquy ended. Day by day the absence of Agnes wore away, and day after day some business preparatory to departure dispatched. Sometimes the hours were winged by her having to pull about all the finery in her possession, and dividing it into portions, some to be abandoned for ever, some to be enveloped with reverent care in cotton and silver paper for her future use, and some to be given to the favoured Agnes. While such cares occupied her hands, her thoughts naturally enough hurried forward to the time when she should lay aside her weeds. This was a dress so hatefully unbecoming in her estimation, that she firmly believed the inventor of it must have been actuated by some feeling akin to what was instituted the horrible Hindoo rite of which she had heard, whereby living wives were sacrificed to their departed husbands. " Only," she cried, bursting out into involuntary thanksgiving, " ours, thank God, is not for ever." To appear for the first time in the fashionable world in this frightful disguise was quite out of the question ; and consequently she could not make her purposed visit to Clifton till the time was arrived for throwing them off, until, to use her own words, " lilacs and greys were possible." Yet there were other considerations that had weight with her too. " His sister, however, shall just see me in my widow's weeds," thought she. " It may touch her heart, perhaps, and must make her feel how very nearly we are related ; but before any living soul out of the family can come near me, I will take care to look what I really am. 6 months ! It must, I suppose, be 6 months first. Dreadful bore !" The first half of this probationary term was to be passed at Silverton. That was already wearing fast away ; and for the latter part of it she determined to take lodgings in Exeter. " Yes, it shall be Exeter !" she exclaimed, and then added, with a perfect quiver of delight, " Oh, what a difference now from what it was formerly ! How well I remember the time when a journey to Exeter appeared to me the very gayest thing in the world ; and now I should no more think of staying there than a queen would think of passing her life in her bedroom." The more she meditated on the future, indeed, the more enamoured did she become of it, till at length, her affairs being very nearly all brought to a satisfactory conclusion, a restless sort of impatience seized upon her ; and nearly a fortnight before the time fixed for the return of Agnes she wrote a very peremptory letter of recall, but altogether omitted to point out either the mode of conveyance, or the protection she deemed necessary for her during the journey. Perhaps Mrs. Wilmot was not sorry for this, as it afforded her an excuse for remaining herself to the last possible moment with a pupil who had found the way to create almost a maternal interest in her heart, and moreover gave her an opportunity of seeking an interview with the singular but interesting recluse who 5 years before had placed in her hands the endearing though ignorant little girl, whose education had proved a task so unusually pleasing. The principal reason, however, for Mrs. Wilmot's wishing to pay Miss Compton a visit, arose from the description Agnes had given of her conduct towards her, and of the system of non intercourse which was so evidently the little lady's intention to maintain. Without having uttered a word resembling fault finding or complaint, Agnes had somehow or other made the Wilmots feel that, though aunt Betsy certainly did not like her, she liked aunt Betsy a great deal better than she did aunt Barnaby ; and this, added to the favourable impression Miss Compton had herself left upon their minds, made the good Mrs. Wilmot exceedingly anxious that she should not remain ignorant of the treasure she possessed in her young relation. The delay of a few days before Mrs. Wilmot could take her pupil home was inevitable ; and when they arrived Mrs. Barnaby had bustled her affairs into such a state of forwardness, that though she received them without any great appearance of melancholy or ill humour, she hinted pretty plainly that Agnes came too late to be of much use to her in packing. Mrs. Wilmot made a very sufficient apology for the delay, and then took leave, saying that she should remain in Silverton that night, and drive out the next morning to pay her compliments to Miss Compton. The bare mention of the spinster's name at once converted the widow's civility into rudeness. She offered her guest neither refreshment nor accommodation of any kind ; and poor Agnes had the pain of seeing her dearest friend depart to pass the night at an inn, when she would have gladly stood by to watch her slumbers all night, might she have offered her own bed for her use. On the following morning Mrs. Wilmot paid her purposed visit to Miss Compton, and found her in dress, occupation, and mode of life, so precisely what she had been described before, that not a word need be added on the subject. Greatly different, however, was the welcome she accorded that lady to what we have formerly seen her bestow upon her relatives. She greeted her, indeed, with a smile so cordial, and a tone of voice so pleasantly expressive of the satisfaction her visit gave, that it was only when the object of it was brought forward that Mrs. Wilmot too discovered that Miss Compton could be a very cross little old lady when she chose it. " I shall quite long, my dear madam, to hear your opinion of my pupil," said Mrs. Wilmot, " for I cannot but flatter myself that you will be delighted with her." " Then ask me nothing about her, ma'am, if you please," replied the recluse. " But it is near 2 years, Miss Compton, since you saw her, and she is wonderfully improved in that time," said Mrs. Wilmot. " Yet I own I should have thought that even 2 years ago, when you did see her, that you must have found her a very charming girl, full of sweetness and intelligence, and with a face "" We had better say no more about her, if you please, Mrs. Wilmot," tartly interrupted the recluse. " I dare say you made the best you could of her, and it is no fault of yours that old Wisett's great granddaughter should be a Wisett ; but I hate the very sight of her as I do, and have done and ever shall do, that of all their kin and kind ; so it is no good to talk of it." " The sight of her ?" reiterated the astonished Mrs. Wilmot. " Why, my dear Miss Compton, she is reckoned by every one that sees her to be one of the loveliest creatures that nature ever formed. If her timid, artless manners do not please you, it is unfortunate ; but that you should not think her beautiful is impossible." " I beg your pardon, ma'am. I should not care a straw for the manners of a child, for I know that time and care might change them, but it is her person that I can't endure. There is no disputing about taste, you know. I should not have thought, indeed, that she was quite the style for you to admire so violently. But of course that is nothing to me. I know that the look of her eyes and the colour of her cheeks is exactly what I think the most detestable. There is no right or wrong in the matter. It is all fancy, and the sight of her makes me sick. Pray, ma'am, say no more about her." There was but one way in which Mrs. Wilmot could comprehend this extraordinary antipathy to what was so little calculated to inspire it, and this was by supposing that Miss Compton's personal deformity rendered the sight of beauty painful to her ; an interpretation, indeed, as far as possible from the truth ; for the little spinster was peculiarly sensible to beauty of form and expression wherever she found it. But it was the only explanation that suggested itself; and with mingled feelings of pity and contempt, Mrs. Wilmot replied, " There may be no right or wrong, Miss Compton, in a judgment passed on external appearance only ; for it may, as you observe, be purely a matter of taste ; but surely it must be otherwise of an aversion conceived against a near relative, whose amiable disposition, faultless conduct, and brilliant talents, justly entitle her to the love, esteem, and admiration of the whole world. This is not merely a matter of taste, and in this there may be much wrong." Miss Compton appeared struck by these words, but after pondering a moment upon them, replied, " And how can I tell, Mrs. Wilmot, but that your judgment of this child's character and disposition may be as much distorted by unreasonable partiality, as your opinion of her vulgar looking person?" A new light here broke in upon the mind of Mrs. Wilmot. She remembered the remarkable plumpness of the little Agnes before she made that sudden start in her growth which, in the course of 2 important years, had converted a clumsy looking child into a tall, slight, elegant made girl ; and with greatly increased earnestness of manner she answered, " I only ask you to see her once, Miss Compton. I have no wish whatever that your judgment should be influenced by mine with respect either to the person or the mind of Agnes Willoughby ; but I greatly wish that your own opinion of her should be formed upon what she now is, and not upon what she has been. I am sure you must feel that this is reasonable. Will you then promise me that you will see her?" " I will," replied Miss Compton. " The request is reasonable, and I promise to comply with it. Yet it can only be on one condition, Mrs. Wilmot." " And what is that, Miss Compton? "" That I may see her without her horrid aunt Barnaby." Mrs. Wilmot smiled involuntarily, but answered gravely, " Of course, Miss Compton, that must be as you please. Rather than you should fail to see my pretty Agnes, I will remain another day from home on purpose to bring her to you myself. Will you receive us if we come over to you at this hour to morrow morning?" " I will," again replied the recluse ;" and whatever may be the result of the interview, I shall hold myself indebted to the kind feelings which have led you to insist upon it." " Thank you, thank you," said Mrs. Wilmot, rising to take her leave. " To morrow, then, you will see me again with my young charge." CHAPTERS IX and X. Volume 1, Chapters XI and XII of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER XI. An important correspondence and an important interview. On returning to her solitary quarters at the King's Head, Mrs. Wilmot called for pen, ink, and paper, and wrote the following note to her young pupil. " My dear Agnes, I am just returned from a visit to Compton Basset, where I was very kindly received by your aunt. She wishes to see you before you leave the neighbourhood, and I have promised to take you to her to morrow morning. I will therefore call at 11 o'clock, when I hope I shall find you ready to accompany me. With compliments to Mrs. Barnaby, believe me, dear Agnes, affectionately yours, Mary Wilmot. To this epistle she speedily received the following answer. Mrs. Barnaby presents her compliments to Mrs. Wilmot, and begs to know if there is any reason why she should not join the party to Compton Basset to-morrow morning. If not, she requests Mrs. Wilmot's permission to accompany her in the drive, as the doing so will be a considerable convenience. Mrs. Barnaby wishes to pay her duty to her aunt before she leaves the country. To return a negative to this request was disagreeable. Being absolutely necessary, however, it was done without delay. But it was with burning cheeks and flashing eyes that Mrs. Barnaby read the following civil refusal. Mrs. Wilmot regrets extremely that she is under the necessity of declining the company of Mrs. Barnaby to-morrow morning, but Miss Compton expressly desired that Agnes should be brought to her alone. To this Mrs. Barnaby replied, as Mrs. Wilmot has been pleased to take upon herself the office of go-between, she is requested to inform Miss Betsy Compton that the aunt who has adopted Agnes Willoughby intends to bestow too much personal care upon her to permit her paying any visits in which she cannot accompany her. The vexed and discomfited Mrs. Wilmot returned to Compton Basset with these two notes in her hand instead of the pretty Agnes, and her mortification was very greatly increased by perceiving that the disappointment of the old lady fully equalled her own. This obvious sympathy of feeling led to a more confidential intercourse than had ever before taken place between the solitary heiress and any other person whatever. So contrary, indeed, was this species of frank communication in her habits, that it was produced rather by the necessity of giving vent to her angry feelings than for the gratification of confessing any other. In reply to her first indignant burst of resentment, Mrs. Wilmot said, I lament the consequences of this ill-timed impertinence for my poor pupil's sake, more than it is easy for me to explain to you, Miss Compton. Do me the justice to believe that I am not in the habit of interfering in the family concerns of my pupils, and then you will be better able to appreciate the motives and feelings which still lead me to urge you not to withdraw your protection and kindness from Agnes Willoughby. I do believe that your motives are excellent, and I can believe too that if your pupil deserve half you have said of her, the protection and kindness even of such a being as myself might be more beneficial to her than being left at the mercy of this hateful, vulgar-minded woman. But what would you have me do, Mrs. Wilmot? You would not ask me to leave my flowers, my bees, my books, and my peaceful home, to keep watch over Mrs. Barnaby, and see that she does not succeed in making this poor girl as detestable as herself. You would not expect me to do this, would you? No, Miss Compton, no one, I think, would willingly impose such a task upon you as that of watching Mrs. Barnaby, but I see no objection to your watching Agnes. And how is the one to be done without the other? It is quite natural that the child of one of Miss Martha Wisett's daughters should live with the other of them. My relationship to this girl is remote in comparison to hers. Miss Compton, replied Mrs. Wilmot, I fear that my acquaintance with you hardly justifies the pertinacity with which I feel disposed to urge this point. But indeed, it is of vital importance to one that I very dearly love, and one whom you would dearly love too, would you permit yourself to know her. Do not apologize to me for the interest you take in her, returned the old lady in a tone rather more encouraging. There is more need, perhaps, that I should apologize for the want of it. And, to say the truth, she added after a considerable pause, I have no objection to explain my motives to you, though it has never fallen in my way before to meet any one to whom I wished to do this. My life has been an odd one. Though surrounded by human beings with whom I have lived on the most friendly terms, I have passed my existence, as to anything like companionship, entirely alone. I have never been dull, for I have read incessantly, and altogether I think it likely that I have been happier than most people. But in the bosom of this unrepining solitude it is likely enough that I have nursed opinions into passions and distastes into hatred. Thus, Mrs. Wilmot, the reasonable opinion that I set out with, for instance, when inheriting my father's long-descended acres, that it was my duty in all things to sustain as much as in me lay the old claim to gentle blood which attached to my race, injured perhaps in some degree by this division of its patrimony in my favour, even this reasonable opinion, Mrs. Wilmot, has by degrees grown, perhaps, into unreasonable strength,
for I would rather, madam, press age and ugliness remarkable as my own to my heart, as the acknowledged descendant of that race, than a vulgar, coarse-minded, coarse-looking thing, though she were as buxom as Martha Wisett when my poor silly brother married her." The latter part of this speech was uttered with great rapidity, and an appearance of considerable excitement ; but this quickly subsided, and the little spinster became as pale and composed as usual, while she listened to Mrs. Wilmot's quiet accents in reply. " There is nothing to surprise me in this, Miss Compton. The feeling is a very natural one. But the more strongly it is expressed, the more strongly must I wonder at your permitting the sole descendant of your ancient race to be left at the mercy of a Mrs. Barnaby." Not all the eloquence in the world could have gone so far towards obtaining the object Mrs. Wilmot had in view as this concluding phrase. " You are right, excellent woman, you are right, and I deserve to see my father's acres peopled by a race of Barnabys. I will save her." And here the poor old lady stopped. A sudden panic seized her, and she sat for several minutes positively trembling at the idea that she might unadvisedly take some step which should involve her in the horrible necessity of being encumbered for the rest of her life with a companion whose looks or manner might remind her of a Martha Wisett or a Mrs. Barnaby. " I dare not do it," she exclaimed at last. " Do not ask it, do not force me ; or at any rate contrive to let me see her first, in a shop or in the street, or any way. I can decide on nothing till I have seen her." " I would do anything within my power to arrange this for you," replied Mrs. Wilmot ;" but I cannot delay my return beyond to morrow, nor do I believe that my agency would render this more easy. Why should you not at once call on both your nieces, Miss Compton? There would be no difficulty in this, and it would give you the best possible opportunity of judging both of the appearance and manners of Agnes." " Both my nieces !— no difficulty ! You understand little or nothing of my feelings. But go home, Mrs. Wilmot. Do your own duty, which is a plain one, and leave me to find out mine, if I can." " You will not, then, abandon the idea of seeing this poor girl, Miss Compton ?"" No, I will not," was the reply, pronounced almost solemnly. " Then farewell, my dear madam. I can ask no more than this, except, indeed, your forgiveness for having asked thus much so perseveringly." " I thank you for it, Mrs. Wilmot. I believe you are a very good woman, and I will endeavour to act, if God will give me grace, as I think you would approve, if you could read all the feelings of my heart. Farewell." And so they parted, the active, useful matron to receive the eager welcome of her expecting family, and the solitary recluse to the examination of her own thoughts, which were alternately both sweet and bitter, sometimes cheering her with a vision of domestic happiness and endearment to soothe her declining age, and sometimes making her shudder as she fancied her tranquil existence invaded and destroyed by the presence of one whom she might strive in vain to love. CHAPTER XII. Choosing a Lady's Maid. A happy meeting unhappily broken in upon. Miss Compton utters a long farewell to Agnes. Mrs. Wilmot did not leave Silverton without taking an affectionate leave of Agnes ; and when this was over, the poor girl felt herself wholly and for ever consigned to the authority and companionship of Mrs. Barnaby. It would be difficult to trace out the cause of the sharp pang which this conviction brought with it, but it was strong enough at that moment to rob the future of all the bright tints through which eyes of 16 are apt to look at it. She cherished, certainly, a deep feeling of gratitude for the kindness that afforded her a home ; but unhappily, she cherished also a feeling equally strong that it was less easy to repay the obligation with affection than with gratitude. Not a syllable had been said to her by Mrs. Wilmot respecting the interview she was still likely to have with her aunt Compton ; for she had promised this secrecy to the nervous and uncertain old lady, who, while trembling with anxious impatience to see this important niece, shrunk before the difficulty she foresaw in finding such an opportunity as she sought, for she still resolutely persevered in her determination not to see Mrs. Barnaby with her. But yet, when finally she did contrive to come within sight of the poor girl, it was exactly under the circumstances she so earnestly wished to avoid. Mrs. Barnaby, in her often meditated estimate of revenue and expenses, had arrived at the conclusion that she ought not to travel without a maid, but that the said maid must be hired at the lowest rate of wages possible.
The necessity for this addition to her suite did not arise from any idle wish for her personal attendance, to which she had never been much accustomed, but from the conviction that there was something in the sound of my maid which might be of advantage to her on many occasions. The finding out and engaging a girl that might enact the character of lady's maid showily and cheaply, was the most important thing still left to be done before they quitted Silverton. The first qualification was a tall person, that might set off to advantage such articles of the widow's cast-off finery as might be unnecessary for Agnes, the next a willingness to accept low wages. While meditating on the subject, it occurred to Mrs. Barnaby that one of the girls she had seen walking in procession to church with the charity school was greatly taller than all the rest, and, in fact, so remarkably long and lanky that she felt convinced she might, if skilfully dressed up, pass extremely well for a stylish lady's maid. Delighted at the idea, she immediately summoned Agnes to walk with her to the schoolhouse, which was situated outside the town, about a mile, on the road leading to Compton Basset. On reaching the building, her knock was answered by the schoolmistress herself, who civilly asked her commands. " I must come in, Mrs. Sims, before I can tell you," was the reply, and it was quite true. For, as Mrs. Barnaby knew not the name of her intended Abigail, the only mode of entering upon her business must be by pointing out the girl whose length of limb had attracted her. But no sooner had she passed the threshold than she perceived the long and slender object of her search immediately opposite to her, in the act of taking down a work basket from the top of a high commode; which manoeuvre, as it placed her on tiptoe, and obliged her to stretch out her longitude to the very utmost, displayed her to the eyes of Mrs. Barnaby to the greatest possible advantage, and convinced her very satisfactorily that her judgment had not erred. " That is the girl I wanted to speak about," she said, pointing to the lizard-like figure opposite to her. " What is her name, Mrs. Sims? "" This one, ma'am, as is fetching my basket? " interrogated Mrs. Sims in her turn. " Yes, that one, that tall girl. What is her name? "" Betty Jacks, ma'am, is her name." "Jacks?" repeated Mrs. Barnaby, a little disconcerted. " Jacks ! That won't do. I can never call her Jacks. But, for that matter, I could give her another name easy enough, to be sure. And what is she good for? What can she do?" " Not over much of anything, ma'am. She was put late to me ; but she can read and iron a little, and can do plain work well enough when she chooses it." " When she chooses it? And she'll be sure to choose it, I suppose, when she goes to service? I want a girl to wait upon me, and to sew for me when she has nothing else to do, and I think this one will do for me very well." " I ask your pardon, ma'am," replied Mrs. Sims, " but if I might make so bold, I would just say that for a notable, tidy, good girl, Sally Wilkins there, that one at the end of the form, is far before Betty Jacks in being likely to suit." " What, that little thing? Why, she is a baby, Mrs. Sims. She is 11 months older than Betty Jacks, ma'am, and greatly beyond her in every way." " But I don't like the look of such a little thing. The other would do for what I want much better. Come here, Betty Jacks. Should you like to go out to service with a lady who would take care that you should always be well dressed, and let you travel about with her, and see a great deal of the world?" " Yes, my lady," replied the young Maypole, grinning from ear to ear, and showing thereby a very fine set of teeth. "Well, then, Betty Jacks, I think we shall suit each other very well. But I shan't call you Betty, though, nor Jacks either, mind that. You won't care about it, I suppose, if I find some pretty, genteel sounding name for you, will you?" " No, my lady," responded the delighted girl. " Very well. And I will give you £3 a year wages, and good clothes enough to make you look a deal better than ever you did before. What do you say to it?" " I'll be glad to come and thank ye too, my lady, if father will let me." " Who is her father, Mrs. Sims? "" Joe Jacks, the carpenter, ma'am." " I don't suppose he is likely to make much objection to her getting such a place as mine, is he?" " That is what I can't pretend to say, ma'am," replied the schoolmistress very gravely. " I don't think Betty over steady myself, but of course it is no business of mine, and it will be far best that you should see Joe Jacks yourself, ma'am, and hear what he says about it." " To be sure. And where can I see him? "" He'll be certain to be here to morrow morning, ma'am, for he'll come to be paid for the bench he made for me ; and if so be you would take the trouble to call again just about 1, when Betty will be going home with him for the half holiday they always have of a Saturday, why then, ma'am, you'd be quite sure to see him, and hear what he'd got to say." " Very well, then, that will do, and we shall certainly walk over again to morrow, if the weather is anything like fine. Good morning to you, Mrs. Sims. Mind what I have said to you, Betty, This is a fine chance for you, and so you must tell your father. Come along, Agnes." It so chanced that within half an hour of their departure Miss Compton also paid a visit to the school. Mrs. Sims was one of the persons whom she had saved from severe and probably lasting penury by one of those judicious loans, which, never being made without good and sufficient knowledge of the party accommodated, were sure to be repaid, and enabled her to perform a most essential benefit without any pecuniary loss whatever. There were no excursions which gave the old lady so much pleasure as those which enabled her to contemplate the good effects of this rational species of benevolence, and Farmer Wright never failed to offer her a place in his chaise cart whenever his business took him near any of the numerous cottages where this agreeable spectacle might greet her. On the present occasion he set her down at the door of the schoolhouse while he called upon a miller at no great distance; and Mrs. Sims, who was somewhat disturbed in mind by the visit and schemes of Mrs. Barnaby, no sooner saw her enter than she led her through the throng of young stitchers and spellers to the tidy little parlour behind. " Well now, Miss Compton, you are kindly welcome," she said, " and I wish with all my heart you had been here but a bit ago, for who should we have here, ma'am, but your own niece, Mrs. Barnaby?" Miss Compton knit her brows with an involuntary frown. " And that sweet pretty creature, Miss Willoughby, corned with her. She is a beauty to be sure, if ever there was one." " What did they come for, Mrs. Sims? " inquired Miss Compton with sudden animation. " Why, that is just what I want to tell you, ma'am, and to ask your advice about. She come here, Mrs. Barnaby I mean, to look after that saucy Betty Jacks, by way of taking her to be her servant, and travelling about with her. And upon my word, Miss Compton, she might just as well take my cat there, for any good or use she's likely to be of. And besides that, ma'am, I have no ways a good opinion of the child, for child she is, though she's a monster in tallness. She does not speak the truth, Miss Compton, and that's what I can't abide, and I don't think she'll do me any credit in any way. But yet I'm afraid it would be doing a bad action if I was to stand in the girl's light, and prevent her going, by telling all the ill I think of her, when they comes again to-morrow to settle about it." Mrs. Sims ceased, and certainly expected a decided opinion from Miss Compton on the subject, for that lady had kept her eyes fixed upon her, and appeared to be listening with very profound attention. But the only reply was, " And do you think the girl will come with her?" " Come with who, ma'am? "" With Mrs. Barnaby, to be sure." " Oh no, ma'am, she won't come with her. She will go home as usual to night, and is to come back to meet the ladies here, a little after noon to morrow, with her father." " But Agnes, Miss Willoughby I mean, are you sure she will come back with her aunt to morrow?" " I am sure I can't say, ma'am, but I think she will ; for I well remember Mrs. Barnaby said with her grand way, ' We will walk over to morrow if the weather be anyways fine.' " Miss Compton now seemed sunk in profound meditation, of which Mrs. Sims fully hoped to reap the fruits ; but once more she was disappointed, for when Miss Compton again spoke, it was only to say, " I want to see Agnes Willoughby, Mrs. Sims, and I do not want to see Mrs. Barnaby. Do you think you could manage this for me if I come here again to morrow?" " I am sure, ma'am," replied Mrs. Sims, looking a little surprised and a little puzzled, " I am sure there is nothing that I am not in duty bound to do for you, if done it can be ; and if you will be pleased to say how the thing shall be managed, I will do my part with a right good will to make everything go as you wish." This was a very obliging reply, but it showed Miss Compton that she must trust to her own ingenuity for discovering the ways and means for putting her design in practice. After thinking about it a little, and looking round upon the locale, she said, " I will tell you how it must be. I will be here to morrow before the time you have named to them, and you shall place me in this room. When Mrs. Barnaby is engaged in talking to the girl and her father, take Agnes by the hand and lead her in to me, saying, if you will, that you have something you wish her to see, which will be no more than the truth. If Mrs. Barnaby happens to hear this and offers to follow, then, as you value my friendship, close the door and lock it. Never mind what she thinks of it. I will take care her anger shall do you no harm." " Oh dear, ma'am, I am not the least afraid of Mrs. Barnaby's anger, nor do I expect she will take any notice. She seems so very hot upon having that great awkward hoyden, Betty Jacks, that I don't think, when she is engaged with her father about it, she will be likely to take much heed of Miss Agnes and me. But at any rate, Miss Compton, I'll take good care, ma'am, that she shan't come a-near you. And now, ma'am, will you be so good as to tell me if you think I shall be doing a sin letting this idle hussy set off travelling with her?" " No sin at all, Mrs. Sims," replied Miss Compton with decision.
Let the girl be what she may, depend upon it she is quite " But here she stopped, adding a minute after, " Do go, Mrs. Sims, and see if Farmer Wright's cart is come back." A few minutes more brought the humble vehicle to the door, when the heiress climbed to her accustomed place in it, and gave herself up to meditation so unusually earnest, as not only to defeat all the good farmer's respectful attempts at conversation, but to occupy her for one whole hour after her return, and that so completely as to prevent her from opening her half-read volume, though that volume was Walter Scott's. Thoughts and schemes were working and arranging themselves in her head, which were, in truth, important enough to demand some leisure for their operations. This beauty, if ever there was one, this poor motherless and father-forgotten Agnes, this inevitable heiress of the Compton acres, ought she, because she had found her short and fat 2 years before, to abandon her to the vulgar patronage of the hateful Mrs. Barnaby? A blush of shame and repentance mantled her pale cheek as this question presented itself, and she acknowledged to her own heart the sin and folly of the prejudice which had led her to turn away from the only being connected with her, to whom she could be useful. She remembered, too, in this hour of self-examination and reproach, that the father of this ill-treated girl was a gentleman, and that she ought, therefore, to have been kindly fostered by the last of the Comptons as a representative more worthy to revive their antiquated claims to patrician rank than could have been reasonably expected from any descendant of her brother Josiah. These thoughts having been sufficiently dwelt upon, examined, and acknowledged to be just, the arrangement of her future conduct was next to be considered; and, notwithstanding the singularly secluded life she had led, the little lady was far from being ignorant of the entire change it would be her duty to make in the whole manner of her existence, should she decide upon taking Agnes Willoughby from Mrs. Barnaby, and becoming herself her sole guardian and protectress. Could she bear this, and could she afford it? The little weak-looking but wiry frame of the spinster had a spirit within it of no inconsiderable firmness, and the first of these questions was soon answered by a mentally ejaculated " I will," which in sincerity and intensity of purpose was well worth the best vow ever breathed before the altar. For the solution of the other, the old lady turned to her account books, and found the leading items in the column of receipts to be as follow: By annual rent from the Compton Basset farm, £600. By interest on £12,000 in the 3 per cents, £360. By interest on £1,800 lent on mortgage at £5 per cent, £90. By interest on £6,000 lent on mortgage at £4 per cent, £240. By interest on £2,500 lent on mortgage at £5 per cent, £125, for a total of £1,415. Of this income, the last item of which, however, had been entered only 3 weeks before, being the result of the latest appropriation of her savings, Miss Compton spent not one single farthing, nor had done so since the payment in advance of £350 to Mrs. Wilmot for the education and dress of Agnes. In fact, the profits arising from the honey she sold fully furnished all the cash she wanted, as her stipulated supplies from the farm amounted very nearly to all that her aesthetic table required. She used neither tea nor wine, milk supplying their place. She had neither rent, taxes, nor servants to pay, and her toilette, though neat to admiration, cost less than any lady would believe possible, who had not studied the enduring nature of stout and simple habiliments when worn as Miss Compton wore them. Such being the facts, it might be imagined that a schedule like the above would have appeared to such a possessor of such an income a sufficient guarantee against any possible pecuniary embarrassment from inviting one young girl to share it with her. But Miss Compton, as she sat in her secluded bower, had for years been looking out upon the fashionable world through the powerful, though somewhat distorting lunettes d'approche furnished by modern novels; and if she had acquired no other information thereby, she at least had learned to estimate with some tolerable degree of justness the difference between the expense of living in the world and out of it. "If I adopt her and make her wholly mine," thought she, "it shall not be for the purpose of forming her into a rich country town miss. She shall be introduced into the world. She shall improve whatever talents nature may have given her by lessons from the best masters. Her dress shall be that of a well-born woman of good fortune, and she shall be waited upon as a gentlewoman ought to be. Can I do all this, and keep her a carriage besides for 1,400 a year? No," was uttered aloud by the deeply meditative old lady. What then was she to decide upon? Should she wait for 2 more years before she declared her intentions, and by aid of the farther sum thus saved enable herself to reach the point she aimed at? Something that she took for prudence very nearly answered yes, but was checked by a burst of contrary feeling that again found vent in words. And while I am saving hundreds of pounds, may she not be acquiring thousands of vulgar habits that may again quench all my hopes? No, it shall be done at once. So at length she laid her head on her pillow, resolved to take her heiress immediately under her own protection, provided always that the examination which was to take place on the morrow should not prove that the Wise's style of beauty was unbearably predominant, and that having arranged with her honest tenant some fair equivalent for her profitable apiary, her lodgings, and her present allowances, she should take her at once to London, devote 1 year to the completion of her education, and leave it to fate and fortune to decide what manner of life they should afterwards pursue. For a little rustic old woman, who had never in her life travelled beyond the country town of her native shire, this plan was by no means ill concocted, and must, I think, display very satisfactorily to all unprejudiced eyes the great advantages to be derived from a long and diligent course of novel reading, as without it Miss Compton would, most assuredly, never have discovered that 1400 a year was insufficient to supply the expenses of herself and her young niece. But, alas! all this wisdom was destined to be blighted in the bud. Miss Compton was true to her appointment, and so was Mrs. Barnaby. The fair Agnes, too, failed not to make her appearance; and moreover the critical eyes of the old lady failed not to discover, at the very first glance, that no trace of wisest vulgarity was there to lessen the effect of her exceeding loveliness. But all this was of no avail, for the matter went in this wise. The first who arrived of the parties expected by Mrs. Sims was Joe Jacks, the carpenter. His daughter Betty had given him such an account of the proposal made to her as caused him to be exceedingly anxious for its acceptance; and he now came rather before the appointed time, in order to hint pretty plainly to Mrs. Sims that he should take it very ill if she did not give a good word to help his troublesome Betty off his hands. Then came Miss Compton, who walked straight through the schoolroom and ensconced herself in the little parlour behind it, and in about 10 minutes afterwards the stately Mrs. Barnaby and her graceful companion arrived also. Mrs. Sims was by no means deficient in her manner of managing the little intrigue entrusted to her. She waited very quietly till she perceived Mrs. Barnaby completely occupied in making the carpenter understand that if she engaged to find shoes, shifts, and flannel petticoats for his daughter, as well as all her finery, the wages could not be more than £2. And then she laid a gentle hand on Agnes, who, not being particularly interested in the discussion, suffered herself to be abducted without resistance, and in the next moment found herself in the presence of Miss Compton. The young girl knew her in a moment, for she had made a deep impression on her memory, both by her kindness at one period, and her capricious want of it at another. But far different was the effect of memory in the old lady, for not only was she unable to recognise in the figure before her the Agnes of her recollection, or rather of her fancy, but it was not immediately that she could be made to believe in the identity. " You do not mean to tell me, Mrs. Sims, that this young lady is Agnes Willoughby? " said she, rising up, and really trembling from agitation. " Dear me, yes, Miss Compton, to be sure it is." " Do you not know me, dear aunt? " said Agnes, approaching her, and timidly holding out her hand. " Your aunt? Am I really your aunt? Is it possible that you are my poor brother's grandchild?" " I am Agnes Willoughby," replied the young girl, puzzled and almost frightened by the doubts and the agitation she witnessed. " If you are," exclaimed Miss Compton, suddenly embracing her, " I am a more guilty creature than I ever thought to be." At this moment, and while the arms of the diminutive spinster were still twined round the person of Agnes, who had just decided in her own mind that her great aunt was the most unintelligible person in the world, the door of the little parlour opened with a jerk that showed it yielded to no weak hand, and the full-blown person of the widow Barnaby stood before them. Her eyes and her rouge were as bright as ever, and her sober cap and sable draperies vainly, as it should seem, endeavoured to soften those peculiarities of the Wise's aspect against which Miss Compton had sworn eternal hatred, for never had she appeared more detestable. Her usual bravura manner indeed was somewhat exaggerated by her indignation at the concealment which had been attempted, and which had been adroitly pointed out to her by the sharp-witted Betty Jacks. " So you thought I should not find you out, I suppose?" she exclaimed as she shut the door behind her. " God give me patience
cried the irritated recluse, suddenly disengaging herself from Agnes. " This is strange persecution, Mrs. Barnaby," and as she spoke she endeavoured to effect her retreat. But this could not be done in a straight direction, inasmuch as it required a considerable circuit safely to weather either side of the expansive widow ; and before Miss Compton reached the door, the lady had so established herself before it as to render her leaving the room without permission absolutely impossible. The time had been when the hope of getting something out of the little hunchback would have enabled Mrs. Barnaby to put a very strong restraint upon any feeling likely to offend her, but this was over. She thought her turn was come now, and considered her own revenues and her own position as so immeasurably superior to those of the little old woman clothed in gray, who stood shaking before her, that her pride would never have forgiven her avarice had it led her to neglect this favourable opportunity of displaying some of the contempt and scorn which she had felt she had heretofore received from her. " Upon my word, Miss Compton," she began, " I do really wonder you are not ashamed of yourself to come visiting this vulgar body, Mrs. Sims, instead of profiting by the notice of your own relations, which might do you honour. And your dress, Miss Compton, what must my niece, Miss Willoughby, think at seeing the sister of her own grandfather going about in such a horrid, coarse, miserable stuff gown as that? We all know how you have been squandering your little property upon the beggars you get to flatter you, but that is no reason for behaving as you do towards me. My excellent husband has left me in circumstances of such affluence as might enable me to assist you by the gift of some of my own clothes, if you conducted yourself as you ought to do." This harangue would probably have been cut short had Miss Compton retained breath enough to articulate ; but astonishment and indignation almost choked her. Instead of speaking, she stood still and panted, till Agnes, inexpressibly shocked and terrified, moved a chair towards her, and entreated her to sit down. Her only reply, however, was rudely pushing Agnes and her chair aside, and then with a sort of desperate effort exclaiming, " Woman, let me pass." " Oh yes, you may pass, and welcome," said Mrs. Barnaby, standing aside. " You have behaved to me from first to last more like a fiend than an aunt, and I certainly shall not break my heart if I never set eyes on you again. Come, Agnes, my love, I have concluded my business in this musty smelling place, and now let us be gone. Don't stand fawning upon her. I promise you it will be all in vain. You will get nothing by it, my dear." Distressed beyond measure at this painful scene, and not well knowing how to express the strong feeling which drew her to the side of Miss Compton, Agnes stood timidly uncertain what she ought to do, when Mrs. Barnaby's authoritative voice again uttered, " Come, my dear Agnes, I am impatient to take you away from what I consider so very disgraceful a meeting." Thus painfully obliged to decide upon either taking leave of her older relative, or of departing without it, Agnes turned again towards Miss Compton, and silently bending down, offered to kiss her cheek. But the angry old lady started away from her, saying, " None of that, if you please. No fawning upon me. You are her dear love, and her dear Agnes, and none such shall ever be graced or disgraced by me." And thus saying, she walked past the tittering Mrs. Barnaby and out of the house, preferring the chance of toiling 2 miles to reach her home, rather than endure another moment passed under the same roof with her. End of chapters 11 and 12. Volume 1, Chapter 13 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Mrs. Barnaby sets forth on her travels. The reader takes leave of Miss Compton. Mrs. Barnaby enjoys her journey, and arrives safely at Exeter. Within a week after this unfortunate interview, all Mrs. Barnaby's earthly possessions, excepting her money, were deposited in the waggon that travelled between Silverton and Exeter; and the day afterwards herself, her niece, and her maid, whom she had surnamed Jerningham, the 2 former in the coach, and the latter on the top of it, set forth on their way to that fair and ancient city of the West. Before we follow them thither, we must stop for a moment to bid a long adieu to poor Miss Compton. Unfortunately for her temper as well as her limbs, Farmer Wright did not overtake her till within a few yards of their home; and the agitation and fatigue, both equally unusual to her, so completely overpowered her strength and spirits, that having taken to her bed as soon as she reached her room, she remained in it for above a fortnight, being really feverish and unwell, but believing herself very much worse than she really was. During the whole of this time, and indeed for several months afterwards, she never attempted to separate the innocent image of Agnes from the offensive one of Mrs. Barnaby. The caress which the poor girl had offered with such true tenderness and sympathy, was the only distinct idea respecting her that remained on the mind of Miss Compton ; and this suggested no feeling but that of indignation, from the conviction that Mrs. Barnaby's dear love, not a whit less detestable, was only more artful than herself; or that, not yet being in possession of the wealth of which her hateful protectress boasted, she deemed it prudent to aim at obtaining whatever she herself might have to bestow. Notwithstanding all these disagreeable imaginings, however, the old lady gradually recovered both her health and her usual tranquil equality of spirits, sometimes even persuading herself that she was very glad she had not been seduced by the appearance of Agnes, to sacrifice her own comfort for the advantage of an artful girl, who was, after all, quite as much the granddaughter of a Wisett as of a Compton. Never during the prosperous years that Mrs. Barnaby had been the mistress of her comfortable house at Silverton, excepting perhaps for the delightful interval while she was treated throughout the town as a bride, did she feel half so grand or so happy a personage as now that she had no house at all. There was an elegance and freedom which she never felt conscious of before, in thus setting off upon her travels with what she believed to be an ample purse, of which she was the uncontrolled mistress, a beautiful niece to chaperon, and a lady's maid to wait upon her. And had Agnes, who sat opposite to her, been less earnestly occupied in recalling all the circumstances of her last strange interview with her aunt Compton, she must have observed and been greatly puzzled by the series of, perhaps, involuntary grimaces which accompanied Mrs. Barnaby's mental review of her own situation. A rich and handsome widow! Could fate have possibly placed her in any situation she should have liked so well? This was the question she silently asked herself, and cordially did her heart answer, No. As these thoughts worked in her mind, her dark, well-marked eyebrows raised themselves, her eyes flashed, and her lips curled into a triumphant smile. The person who occupied the transverse corner to herself was a handsome young man, who had joined the Silverton coach, from the mansion of a gentleman in the neighbourhood, to which, however, he was himself quite a stranger; and having in vain tried to get sight of the features concealed by the long crape veil beside him, he took to watching those no way concealed by the short crape veil opposite. Mother and daughter, of course, thought he. A young specimen, without rouge or moustache, would not be amiss. Mrs. Barnaby perceived he was looking at her, and settled her features into dignified but not austere harmony. " It is very pleasant travelling this morning, ma'am," said the young man. " As pleasant as a stage coach can be, I imagine. But I am so little accustomed to the sort of thing, that I am not a very good judge. Do you know, sir, where the coach stops for dinner? "" I cannot say I do. I never travelled this road before." " Then you are not a resident in the neighbourhood? "" No, ma'am, quite a bird of passage. It is the first time I have ever been to Devonshire. It seems to me a beautiful country indeed." " Very." Mrs. Barnaby heartily hoped that no comparisons would follow, as it was not at all her intention to confess, either on the present or any future occasion, that she had never seen any other ; and she therefore rather abruptly changed the conversation by adding, " Do you know, sir, whether there are many outside passengers? I hope my maid will not be annoyed in any way. It is the first time I ever put outside a coach. Poor woman !" thought the young man. " Lost her husband and her money with him, I suppose. I must contrive to look at this tall, slender girl, though." But Agnes seemed little disposed to give him any opportunity of doing so, for she continued to keep her eyes fixed on the scene without, thus very nearly turning her back on her curious neighbour. Mrs. Barnaby's first act of active chaperonship was a very obliging one. She perceived the young man's object, and not having the slightest inclination to conceal the beauty of Agnes, which she held to be one of the many advantages with which she was herself surrounded, she said, " My dear Agnes, do look at that pretty cottage. It is a perfect picture of rural felicity." Agnes obeyed the words, and followed with her eyes the finger that pointed through the opposite window, thus indulging her neighbour with a full view of her exquisite profile. The effect was by no means what Mrs. Barnaby expected. The young man looked, and instead of being led by what he saw into talkative civility, he became very respectfully silent. But respectful silence was not an offering to which Mrs. Barnaby, in the most brilliant season of her beauty, had ever been accustomed. It puzzled her, till a thought struck her which is worth recording, because it very greatly influenced her conduct and feelings for a long time afterwards. This gentleman, whose attentions for the journey she greatly wished to conciliate, had addressed her in the easy style by which fast young men are apt to believe they can propitiate the favour of every woman somewhat under 50 years of age, and somewhat, too, beneath themselves in condition. Our traveller had no fear of blundering when he settled that Mrs. Barnaby belonged to this class; but the instant he caught a glimpse of the countenance of Agnes, he became equally sure that she at least belonged to a higher one. It was not wonderful that poor Miss Compton doubted, when she looked at her, the possibility of her being a descendant of the buxom Martha Wisett, for, excepting something in the form and soft lustre of her dark brown eyes, her features bore no resemblance to her mother, or her mother's family, but a most decided one to that of her father, who, though a very foolish, hot-headed lieutenant, when we made his acquaintance, was descended from a race of aristocratic ancestors, rather remarkable for their noble and regular cast of features, which appeared indeed to be their least alienable birthright. The traveller, though a young man, had lived sufficiently in the world to have learned at least the alphabet of character as written on the countenances of those he met, and he spelt gentlewoman so plainly on that of Agnes, that he felt no more right to address her without introduction than he would have done had the stage-coach been an opera-box. " That's very odd," thought Mrs. Barnaby. " She certainly is a most beautiful creature, quite as handsome as I was even in poor dear Tate's days, and yet the moment he got a sight of her his pleasant gay manner changed all at once, and he now looks as glum as a boy at school. Though she is my niece, she is not like me, that's certain ; and who knows but that many men may still prefer my style to hers? As to this one, at least, it is impossible to doubt it, and it will be a great folly in me to set out with a fancy that my face and figure, especially when I get back to dress again, will not stand a comparison with hers. For some years, at any rate, in justice to myself, I will keep this in mind, and not take it for granted that every glance directed towards us is for the child, and not for the woman." This agreeable idea seemed all that was wanting to make the journey perfectly delicious, and not even the continued reserve of the young man could affect in any great degree the charming harmony of her spirits. We hear much of the beautiful freshness of hope in young hearts just about to make their first trial of the joys of life ; but it is quite a mistake to suppose that any such feeling can equal the fearless, confident, triumphant mastery and command of future enjoyment, which dilates the heart in the case of such an outcoming widow as Mrs. Barnaby. The Silverton coach set its passengers down at Street's Hotel, in the churchyard ; and my heroine, who now for the first time in her life found herself at an inn, with the power of ordering what she chose, determined to enjoy the twofold gratification of passing for a lady of great fashion and fortune, and of taking especial care of her creature comforts into the bargain. " Do you want rooms, ma'am? " said the head of a waiter, suddenly placing itself among the insides. " Yes, young man, I want the best rooms in the house. Where is my maid? Let her be ready to attend me as soon as I get out. We have nothing with us but 3 trunks, 1 square box, 1 hat box, 2 carpet bags, and my dressing case. Let everything be conveyed to my apartments. Now open the door, and let me get out. Follow me, Agnes. You will come, if you please, without delay, young man, to receive my orders respecting refreshments." 2 lighted candles were snatched up as they passed the bar, and Mrs. Barnaby proceeded up the stairs in state, the waiter and his candles before, Agnes and " my maid " behind. " This room is extremely dark and disagreeable. Pray send the master of the house to me. I wish to give my orders to him." " My master is not at home, ma'am." " Not at home ? Extremely negligent, I must say. Perhaps it will be better for me to proceed to some other hotel, where I may be able to see the head of the establishment. I have not been accustomed to be treated with anything like neglect. People of my condition, indeed, seldom are. If you will be pleased, my lady, to give your orders to me," said the waiter very respectfully, " you shall find nothing wanting that belongs to a first-rate house." " Then pray send my maid to me. Oh, there you are, Jerningham." " Yes, ma'am," answered the gawky soubrette, tucking back the veil with which Mrs. Barnaby had adorned one of her own bonnets, and staring at the draperied windows, and all the other fine things which met her eyes. " You will see, Jerningham, that my sleeping apartment is endurable." Now, Betty Jacks, though careless and idle, was by no means a stupid girl ; but she was but 15 years old, and her experiences not having hitherto been upon a very extended scale, She found herself at a loss to understand what her new mistress meant, about 9 times out of every 10 that she spoke to her. On receiving the order above mentioned, she meditated for an instant upon what an endurable sleeping apartment might be, but the sagacity which failed to discover this sufficed to suggest the advantage of not confessing her ignorance, and she answered boldly, " Yes, sure, ma'am." " Go then," said the lady, languidly throwing her person upon a sofa, and then turning to the waiter, who still remained with the door in his hand, she pronounced with impressive emphasis, " Let there be tea, sugar and cream brought, with buttered toast, and muffins also, if it be possible. Agnes, my love, I am afraid there is hardly room for you on the sofa, but sit down, dear, and try to make yourself comfortable on a chair." The two ladies were now left to themselves, Betty Jacks joyfully accompanying the smart young waiter to the regions below. " And who may be your missus, my dear? " he said, giving her an encouraging chuck under the chin. " She can't have much to do, I'm thinking, with any of the county families, for they bean't much given to stage coaches, and never without their own gentlemen to guard 'em. Is she a real grand lady, or only a strutting make believe ?" Betty, thinking it much more for her own credit to serve a real grand lady than a make believe, readily answered, " To be sure she is a real grand lady, Mr. Imperdence. We comes up along from Silverton, and she's one of the finest ladies in the town." " In the town," repeated the knowing waiter, significantly. " I understand. Well, she shall have some tea. And now, my girl, you had better go and do what she bid you." " Well now, if I have downright forgot already," said the unblushing Betty, " will you tell me what it was, then ?"" How old are you, my dear ?" was the unsatisfactory reply. " And pray what's that to you ? But come now, do tell me, will you ? What was it missus told me to do ?"" To go see after her bed, my dear, and all that, and unpack her nightcap, I suppose." " Well, then, give me a candle. That's a good man. But where is her bed, though ?"" You bean't quite hatched yet, my gay Maypole, but you'll do well enough some of these days. Here, Susan, show this young waiting maid a bedroom for 2 ladies, and one for yourself too, I suppose, my dear. I shouldn't wonder, Susan, if it was possible the grand lady up stairs may pay less than a duchess, but take my word for it she'll blow you sky high if you don't serve her as if you thought she was one." " How did she come ?" snappishly inquired the chambermaid. " By the Royal Regulator," answered the waiter. " But inside, Susan, inside, you know, and with her lady's maid here to wait upon her. So mind what you're about, I tell you." " Come this way, young woman, if you please," said the experienced official, who was not to be bullied out of a first floor room by the report of duchess-like airs, or the sight of a lanky child for a waiting maid. So Betty was made to mount to a proper stage coach elevation. Mrs. Barnaby, however, got her tea and her toast and her muffins, greatly to her satisfaction, even though the master of the establishment knew nothing about it. And though she did make Agnes's slender arm pay for the second flight of stairs, in order to prove how very little used she was to such fatigue, she was, on the whole, well pleased with her room when she reached it, well pleased with her bed, well pleased with her breakfast, and ready to set off as soon as it was over to look out for lodgings and adventures. CHAPTER XIV.